They thought he was just another random person to stop and search. But when he pulled out his phone and made a single call, their whole world turned upside down. At 72 years old, Charles Jefferson had seen enough of the world to know how things worked. But he had also earned the right to enjoy his daily routine. Every afternoon, without fail, he walked 2 blocks to Joe's Coffee on Lincoln Avenue, St. Louis. The barista, a college kid named Ryan, already knew his order: a small black coffee, no sugar. He always sat in the same corner by the window, watching the world move at its usual pace. It was a small moment of peace in his day. But peace is a fragile thing. As Charles stepped out of the cafe, coffee in one hand, newspaper tucked under his arm, he heard the low rumble of an approaching engine. A black and white squad car slowed to a stop a few feet ahead of him. The driver's window was down. Maybe they weren't here for him, he thought. But then the doors opened. 2 officers stepped out. One young, barely in his 20s, with a buzz cut and stiff posture. The other, older, in his 40s, with a build that suggested he enjoyed throwing his weight around. Neither looked friendly. "Sir, can we see some ID?" the younger one asked, his voice flat and rehearsed. Charles blinked at them. His heart didn't race. It didn't need to. He had been through this before, too many times to count. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked calmly. The older cop placed a hand on his belt. "We got a call about a suspicious person matching your description." Charles looked around. The sidewalk wasn't crowded, but enough people were there to see what was happening. A woman pushing a stroller slowed her steps. A man on a bike turned his head. He exhaled slowly. Suspicious? He glanced down at himself. Khaki slacks, a crisp button-up, neatly trimmed gray beard. A newspaper in one hand, a coffee in the other. "You sure about that?" The younger officer squared his shoulders. "We just need to check your ID, standard procedure." Charles had 2 choices: comply and walk away or stand his ground. He was tired of this game, but he wasn't a fool. Slowly, he reached into his pocket for his wallet. But before he could pull it out, "Hands on the car," the older officer ordered, stepping forward. Charles froze. The street noise dulled. The shift in tone was clear. This wasn't about ID anymore. "I'm a 72-year-old man walking home from a coffee shop," Charles said, his voice even. "What exactly am I being detained for?" The younger officer hesitated, but the older one doubled down. "You fit the description." The crowd was watching now. A young man with earbuds had stopped mid-step, phone angled just enough to record. A middle-aged woman in scrubs stood by her car, her eyes locked on the scene. Charles let out a slow breath, keeping his hands visible. He had taught his daughter how to handle situations like this. His father had taught him the same lesson, but none of that mattered. The older cop grabbed his wrist, gripping harder than necessary. "Do you have any weapons?" the younger officer asked. Charles scoffed. "Do I look like I have a weapon?" Then, he did something that changed everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Immediately, the older officer snapped, "Hands where I can see them." But Charles didn't stop. He dialed a number he knew by heart. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then she answered. "Hey, Dad, what's wrong?" Her voice was sharp, focused. The older cop frowned. "Who's he calling?" Charles met his eyes and said clearly, "My daughter, the U.S. Attorney General." Silence. The officers hesitated. The older cop's expression flickered, his jaw tightening. The younger officer shifted, suddenly unsure. Charles held up the phone. "Put me on speaker," his daughter said. Without hesitation, he turned up the volume. "This is Monica Jefferson, U.S. Attorney General," her voice cut through the air like a blade. "Who am I speaking to?" The younger officer stiffened. The older one hesitated. They knew they were in trouble. "Ma'am," the older cop started, his tone shifting. "This is—" "I don't care who you are," Monica interrupted. "You are detaining my father without cause. I expect an explanation." The crowd had grown. More phones were recording. A teenager near the curb watched closely. A woman whispered to the man beside her. The officers scrambled for words. "It was a misunderstanding," the older cop finally muttered. Monica exhaled sharply. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you call this?" Charles let the silence stretch before asking, "Am I free to go?" The officers exchanged a look. Then, with clear reluctance, they stepped back. "Yes, sir," the younger officer said quickly. "You're free to go." Charles didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Then he lifted the phone to his ear. "You still there, Liv?" "Still here, Dad." He allowed himself a small smile. "Guess I'll see you for dinner." And just like that, he walked away. But the world wasn't done watching. The footage spread like wildfire. News anchors dissected the video. Panelists debated police accountability. Social media exploded with outrage. The St. Louis Police Department released a statement. "We are aware of the incident and are conducting an internal review." Same excuses, same empty promises. But this time, something was different. People weren't looking away. Charles sat by his window, watching reporters set up down the street. His phone buzzed nonstop. Messages of support poured in from old friends, strangers, even former students. A knock at the door. He already knew who it was before he opened it. Monica stood there, arms crossed. "You okay?" He nodded, tired. She sat beside him, both watching the news replay the footage. "They're going to try and contain this," she said. "Suspend the officers with pay. Hope people forget." He sipped his coffee. "They won't forget. Not this time." She studied him, then nodded. "Then let's make sure of it." Charles smiled. "You were always the stubborn one. You raised me that way." His phone buzzed again. More people reaching out. More voices refusing to let this moment slip away. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. He leaned forward, grabbed his coffee, and took a slow sip. "Let's get to work. If stories like this matter to you, don't just watch, stay aware, stay engaged, and stay vocal." Hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more powerful stories on shocking fate. Because change only happens when people refuse to look away.